Hey everybody, have an interesting one for you today. I was able to speak to Benjamin Wittes, who was one of the founders of Lawfare. Lawfare is a website affiliated with the Brookings Institution, and it's a place where former members of the security state go to opine on the issues of the day. So you have former prosecutors and FBI officials and so forth going on Lawfare and expounding on whatever they believe is the correct legal interpretation of current events. And Wittes is the person probably most responsible for shepherding all this into existence. Since the dawn of Trump Russia, Lawfare has seen vastly increased public exposure. It's now reaching a mass audience, and we discussed some of the reasons for that. He and I also have pretty flatly contradicting views on a range of issues around Trump, Russia, and Mueller, and all that. So I was happy that one of our mutual Twitter buddies facilitated, in a way, this conversation. So we were able to convert our Twitter rancor into a fruitful dialogue, which is actually, I think, something that should be more often aspired to. So I actually appreciate that he was willing to do this. This was recorded on May 3rd at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., and let's get to it. Okay. Pleased to be joined by Benjamin Wittes. Thank you for doing this.
Pleasure, I think.
Well, I should say thank you to our mutual Twitter interlocutor who prodded both of us to agreeing to this. I know that there's a particular rancor on social media that maybe doesn't lend itself to an assumption that a good faith dialogue can be had with people with ostensibly differing opinions. Is that your general perspective on how social media tends to function?
I mean, it's funny. I have people on social media with whom I have kind of wildly different views and very warm, pleasant relations that over time actually cause views to converge. And then I have people on social media who I think my views diverge from, microscopically,
right,
and yet in a sort of like Bolshevik, Menshevik kind of way, you end up, in these sort of fratricidal battles.
Yeah.
And so I actually don't think the pleasantness or unpleasantness of relations on social media is especially, at least not in my case, a function of agreement or disagreement. It seems to exist on a different axis.
Well, the classic phrase is the narcissism of small differences, right?
Right, although I don't want to say it's inversely related. Like
right.
the more close somebody is to my views, the less well we get along on
right.
Twitter. It's just like there are people who I, it seems to be unrelated to how testy one's relations on social media are. Don't seem especially well correlated to political agreement or disagreement.
Well, my recollection is that the most heated and vituperative social media, furor tends to erupt among people like within a primary. So if you're, different candidates are battling it out. I remember this in 2016, but Trump versus the others, or Bernie and Hillary, or even now we're seeing the beginnings of it on the Democratic side. So I don't know. Maybe there's some exceptions, and maybe it's just my own kind of myopic view. But that seems to roughly align with what you're.
Maybe. I mean, I don't do politics in the electoral sense,
right.
And
go on, explain.
And so, like that set of issues, like I fully don't expect to have a candidate in the Democratic or Republican primaries to the extent that I don't. That's just sort of not so that kind of fratricidal
right.
stuff is, I am generally a conscientious objector to or from. But I do find that there is the sense in which I completely agree with you is that there is a group of people who on social media, and this has been true as long as I have been on Twitter, and actually before I was on Twitter, it was a creature of the blogosphere.
The message board, the kind of pre-social media era.
Right, who simply will not, who are people who, if you had a social dinner, would not, take you to be a villain, but somehow the articulation of that same view, whatever it may be, in a format in which they can hit respond, reply, really brings out a different relationship and a much more aggravated one that you and look, there's some of that. I don't mean to put all of that on other people. Like there's no format in my dinner party or dinner table conversation where I say boom and put out an image of a.
We're going to talk about the whole boom trope.
Yeah. So to the extent that antagonizes some people, and you seem to be one of them, like I suppose that part of it's on me,
Yeah, I mean, and the Twitter in particular definitely does incentivize abrasiveness and snippiness, but
I think the word this week is snitty.
Snittiness, yes, that's a good one. To quote the illustrious Bill Barr, but. I also don't want to entirely dismiss the value or the utility of being abrasive if you're doing it for a sincere purpose or if you're trying to counteract what you view as, legitimately harmful, discourse in some sense. So, it's easy to kind of malign social media in that respect, but, I feel like it has its uses.
So I don't disagree with that. Sometimes it gets the better of me in terms of
it gets the better of all of us at times.
I find myself caring a little too much, and
too online,
and that's on all of us to disengage at that point.
Right. All right. So let's get to the crux of why we're doing this. Part of what spurred, I guess, the logic behind this discussion is sort of a discrepancy as to the definition of terms. And I want to get to the term which I think is like the nexus of that discrepancy, which is collusion. But if we're defining terms, can you just define how what's the nutshell summarization of what lawfare actually is? Because it seems to have a quasi-journalistic role in that, you guys break news at times, right? I mean, you do reporting in a sense, definitely a lot of analysis, which would seem, at least in our current media ecosystem, to be representative of what people generally regard as journalistic. And yet, I think I've heard you say that you're kind of a defrocked journalist or something to that
That's
effect.
what Shane Harris calls it.
Okay. Well,
and I don't run away from it.
Okay. So you see what I'm getting at there? Like, how do you kind of situate it within the broader spectrum?
Okay, so first of all, thank you for that question, because I actually think it is worth starting with how we understand what lawfare is and what we do, because I think it is different from we're a publication, obviously. We
associated with the Brookings Institution, where we are right now.
Correct. It's an independent organization, but it's produced in cooperation with the Brookings Institution, and I edit it in my capacity as a Brookings scholar. Mm-hmm. So look, it is.
You have a podcast that's well regarded.
We have a podcast. We have two podcasts.
Oh, I didn't realize
we
that.
also have Rational Security.
I thought that was a precursor to the Lawfare podcast.
No, so Rational Security is something that grew up alongside of it and was independent for a while, and Lawfare kind of took over, I guess, a year and a half ago. So. Look, the sense I never know what to call it other than that it is lawfare. But here's the elements of it.
Right.
One element of it is journalism, not in the sense that we behave like a conventional journalistic organization. We don't. We are all practitioners, scholars, commentators, who many of us are involved in the issues that we're writing about.
And you formerly were a more conventional journalist.
Yes, I was a Washington Post editorial writer for 9 years. We also have certain policies that a normal journalistic organization would never have and would consider, I would think, disreputable. So we have a policy: we don't publish classified material. And we do that, we maintain that policy because a bunch of our people have active security clearances, and people go in and out of government. And we also have young people who work for the site while they're in law school or just out of law school who are aspiring to go into government and have maybe security clearance applications pending. And so we, in order to facilitate a deep dialogue with government that does not get anybody in trouble, we have a policy of just taking classified material off the table, and we don't do it. Now,
That never would have passed muster at the Washington Post, for example.
correct, and so I don't want, when Shane calls me a defrocked journalist, he's reflecting accurately that we have a set of behaviors and policies that conventional journalism does not approve of. We try to be totally honest and open and straightforward about it. I describe what Lawfare does as a hybrid in roughly equal parts of academic scholarship, integrating academic work, practice, and journalism. And I don't know a noun that describes what we do, so I just call it producing Lawfare.
You need a new noun.
And anybody can attach whatever disparaging or admiring verbs or adjectives they want to it.
Well, one reason I think why people may look askance at whatever journalistic capacity Lawfare operates in is because if you look at the personnel of Lawfare, I mean, the executive editor, Susan Hennessy, who's your co-podcaster and
Partner in
colleague,
crime.
right? She's a former lawyer for the National Security Agency.
Correct.
Recently, Jim Baker, who's the former general counsel of the FBI, became a contributing editor at Lawfare. So these are people within what you might broadly call the security state apparatus coming on, pretty seamlessly into this kind of somewhat ostensibly journalistic operation. And it's just not how it tends to work for most in the media.
Right. So what I would say is, first of all, your observations are correct. And by the way, it is way more than Susan and Jim.
Yeah.
My co-founder Jack Goldsmith was the head of the Office of Legal Counsel.
Sure.
Most of our senior and our David Criss was the head of the National Security Division. He's one of our senior contributors and the list of people who are deeply associated with Lawfare who have occupied senior positions. Bob Bauer was the White House counsel, right? And so, whether your understanding of what Lawfare does is that we've gotten those people to do journalism, or whether your understanding is we've created an outlet for those people to talk and speak about in their own voices, and whatever you want to call it is fine with me. I believe it is a unique body of work in the world. It's the resource in the world that it is an unrivaled library of expertise in the law of national security. And I don't really deeply care what people call it. I don't represent it as traditional journalism by any means.
Sure.
But in no sense am I anything other than very deeply proud of it.
But can you empathize with why there are some who may view Lawfare with a certain amount of suspicion or even antipathy? Let's say a casual observer who's not intimately acquainted with the genesis of the organization, doesn't fully comprehend the full logic of that you just spelled out there, yet sees Lawfare contributors, contributing to The Atlantic, where you had a piece this week, or sees, Susan Hennessy on CNN, which is just to say the casual news consumer is not going to be immediately acquainted with the distinctions you just outlined there, correct?
Well, I think, like as with any publication, people should be aware of who we are and what we do. We don't exactly make a secret about it.
That's true.
We're not, we're actually proud of it. Everything that you're saying with an air of, anxiety are things that we're actively proud of. And my view is if people don't admire what we do, they should read something else. I mean, I don't. I just it doesn't. I don't think that it doesn't trouble me at all. In fact, I think it is good to affirmative good, which is why I have spent 9 years now building this site, to have this group of voices talking about these issues. And I detect in your question the following subtext. So let's just elevate it to the surface.
Elevate away.
You're saying, don't you understand how people could look at you as a bunch of apologists for the national security state, which has come more recently to be called the deep state?
Or not, if not apologists, you're sort of, just by necessity and by the trajectory career-wise of where people who are contributing to the publication came from, you're imbued with the, roughly speaking, ideology of the security state, or even though the ideology is a little ill-defined and it's not necessarily uniform, but that kind of dictates in some sense the manner in which you approach these issues of the day in a way that if you were just kind of in a more conventional journalistic capacity, maybe that wouldn't be a sort of a live consideration.
So let me say I mostly agree with that, but with a couple of caveats. So the sense in which I mostly agree with it is there is no doubt that we set out, look, the idea that we have a mass audience now is bewildering to me, because that is never what we set out to do.
Right, and that mass audience has arisen because of the extreme interest around Trump-Russia, right?
Yeah, although it started arising before that, interestingly. We built the site to speak to people in government, to have a dialogue, a sort of expert-level dialogue between academics, practitioners, and sort of like crazy, weird actors like me and people who were in government. And we never built it to be a general interest publication.
Right.
And so, look, I fully accept that we built the dialogue that we wanted to have. And I make no apologies for that. And I think, people should be savvy about every publication they read, including ours. Well, that said, I want to say one big caveat, which is one way that we are unlike a lot of publications is that we actually make a point of publishing our critics. And when we write stuff and people disagree with us and they write in, we generally publish it on Lawfare. And from the earliest days of the site, when this was particularly related to my work, I was doing a lot of work on the Guantanamo litigation. We were a principal place where a bunch of the Gitmo bar people were publishing because they were writing to argue with us. And so there is a sense in which I agree we are a locus of a certain government, academic, national security conversation, but we are also the locus of debate over that conversation, including in some areas that, we have published a lot of people who are uncomfortable with the sort of center of gravity of where a lot of Lawfare writers are. The second caveat that I will say is we do not have editorial positions, none. And there is, we host, I try very hard to host the best legal arguments that are being made on the subjects that we cover, including the ones that are most challenging to some of my premises. So, for example, the place where you can see the best arguments against my views of obstruction of justice in the context of Trump's behavior is on Lawfare by other people.
Let me just interject there really quickly because, there are differing perspectives that you can read within Lawfare, including some that may challenge your core beliefs. I acknowledge that, but to the extent that there's disagreement, it's all located within the relatively narrow confines of people who are, in some sense, amongst the kind of broader national security discussion or like members of that relatively limited faction. It's not as if you're going to have like some anarchist writer.
Correct. Correct.
Yeah.
Although, I mean, the conversation is a conversation among practitioners, academics, and sort of journalists and
that by necessity limits the scope.
That does limit the conversation. That says the anarchist writer who wants to make a burn the whole house down argument, who wants to make a really strong legal argument on how, you know, the modalities legally of burning the house down, should get in touch with me because I want to publish that.
Okay, well, I'll see if there's any interested parties. All right, so another thing I want to ask you on that score. So you're now reaching a mass audience, or at least more
mass
than
for us.
For us, more than you would have anticipated 9 years ago.
Yes, dramatically.
Yeah, and do you attribute that dramatic increase virtually entirely to the high amounts of interest around Trump Russia, given the NSA and FBI and CIA components to how the kind of broader narrative is unfolded? Or?
No, it's not entirely. So we were on a pretty significant growth trajectory before Trump ever arose on the scene. And that has probably a lot to do, that probably has a lot to do with the Snowden disclosures.
Right.
But we were an important part of that conversation back when people thought of us as, the unreasonable authoritarian right, as opposed to now when people think of us as libtard radicals. I
don't use that term.
I don't either. I'm joking. There was a steady, serious growth from the time the site was started. It did take off at a different level of speed 3 years ago, sort of as the Trump campaign heated up.
Okay. And I don't want to get to this collusion semantic dispute, but so you are known, and we referenced this at the outset, but you're known for your kind of slogan, boom, which you used on many different occasions, dozens, I'm sure, for the past couple of years when there was some, at least putatively explosive story that was bursting onto the scene and kind of rippling through the social media bloodstream. And obviously it's just somewhat tongue-in-cheek, I guess, because it's not as if like you're making an authoritative declaration of boom, right? So there's a little bit of cheekiness there that's kind of in sync with social media norms. But at the same time, I do think, though, it is significant because, at least from my vantage point, a big feature of Trump Russia and how it's progressed, at least in terms of the media, is that there's been this constant kind of amplification of this kind of frenzied anticipation around the new big revelation, and the walls are closing in, and this is the big smoking gun that's that's finally on the offing after all this time. Do you feel like did you knowingly play into that? Do you think what the whole boom kind of approach had that effect? And again, some may trivialize it, but I actually do think it's relevant because it kind of framed the way people view every kind of incremental development in the saga as this, new kind of, mind-boggling revelation that people had to, immediately drop everything and you get to the bottom of,
Right. So, a couple of thoughts on boom, which, by the way, is not. This is a me thing. It's something that's my Twitter feed. Right. It's not, like Lawfare doesn't publish booms, right? First of all, the booms started not because of the collusion Russia stuff, but because of the obstruction stuff. And it started specifically in connection with disclosures that I was aware of were coming because journalists were calling me in advance of them. They had to do with, the president's relationship with Comey. So there were a series of stories.
Who's a friend of yours?
Yeah, we're friends. And I was the source for one of those stories, quite openly. It was not a leak. It was not, I went to the New York Times and as a result, I knew that.
And this was in 2017.
Correct. The spring of 2017, after Jim was fired, I was aware of some of those of that particular story, and as a result of that, before it came, and so I knew it was coming, and in advance of that, I tweeted tick tick tick, and then when it came out, I tweeted boom. And my point about that was not that it was leading somewhere big, or that it was like, hey, pay attention to this. It's a big deal. Mm-hmm. And to me, what was a big deal about that was that those sequence of stories, one by one, which Bob Mueller now has verified, were detailed a level of pressure that the President of the United States was putting on the FBI director for substantive outcomes in an investigation. And that is an extremely serious matter. And so and I knew that had taken place because I knew about it at the time, and I was anxious about it. And so I went to the press and I talked about it, and I was trying to draw attention to something that I thought was and believe was an extremely serious issue that involved the president's abuse of law enforcement. And, volume 2 of that report is all a validation of whether it's criminal or not. It is a validation of the basic idea that I was trying to pound my fist on the table about, which is that the president was engaging in a simply unacceptable and dangerous fashion with the law enforcement apparatus of the country for political purposes and for self-protective political purposes. Right. And so the first thing I want to say about poor Baby Cannon is that Baby Cannon showed up not in the context of the collusion story, but in the context of this issue. Now, did I believe and do I believe that the collusion question is an important question? Yes. And did Baby Cannon come relatively quickly to flag incremental developments in that? Yes. Do I make any apologies for that? No. Did Baby Cannon get excited about a couple of news stories that did not turn out to be true? Yeah. And one more concession.
Yes.
Did the investigation ultimately not validate at the criminal level the factual premise of every single story that Baby Cannon tweeted about?
Actual cannon, by the way? Is there like somebody gave you a trinket? Okay.
No, I acquired it myself. I have 3 of them.
Okay.
There's Baby Cannon, Baby Cannon.
You'll have to show it to me after this. So
no, they're nice. They're good. You should fire them sometime. I believed, and I still believe, that the investigation was an extremely important undertaking, that the facts required the investigation. And this is, I think, the central point on which you and I disagree, I suspect. I also believe that the results of that investigation from a historical point of view and probably from a counterintelligence point of view, though I'm more cautious about that, amply validate the concerns that those of us had that there was something here that really needed to be investigated. I have never been, and you will not find, I don't think you will find counterexamples of this. I have never been one of the people who has insisted that there was criminal activity of the collusion, that the collusive activity was of a criminal nature that would or needed to be prosecuted at the end of the day. I was quite agnostic about that.
Yeah.
And by the way, you won't see me after the report came out saying, but this should have been, he didn't look at this, if they'd only followed the lead.
Which has been a reaction among some.
Not among me.
Right.
I am perfectly comfortable with the idea that you could investigate this stuff. It could validate my premises or not validate my premises for historical purposes, and it might all not be criminal. That doesn't give me any pause. And it, by the way, doesn't really offend Baby Cannon either.
Let me ask you this. Do you think that in aggregate, all the collusion-related booms some of which you've conceded maybe weren't borne out by the fact of the investigative results, could have had the effect of creating an impression among just the general population, even if we're just going to limit it to the Twitter dwellers, that there was always this shoe about to drop, or that we were reaching a crescendo point that wasn't necessarily, it didn't come to fruition in the way that a lot of people had expected. Do you think that the whole kind of boom narrative, I'm not just singling out you, I think others did much the same thing.
So that's a very interesting question, and I think one on which some reflection on my part is probably justified. So I've sort of done it, but let me do a little bit of out loud. If I had believed in a firm way that there was no way this was going anywhere criminally,
so you did assign some probability that there would be a criminal finding as it relates to collusion throughout this process.
Well, remember, so there was a criminal finding, and there were big most of the booms, predate the hacking indictment and the IRA indictment, and so
in terms of American
right. So in terms of American participation, American criminal participation, I always thought there was a significant chance that would happen.
What was the rough probability, if you could numerically?
I don't know how to, like any retroactive assignment of probability there.
Yeah, probably not going to be accurate.
Let's put it this way. I am not one of the people who you will find an article by, look for an indictment of so-and-so on such and such.
Like the John Brennan prediction where, the Trump family would be indicted at some point.
You're not going to find a Ben Wittes article that says stuff like that, and you're actually not going to find tweets that say that either. The other factor that led me to keep doing booms is ironically exactly the opposite of the one you're thinking of. And I want to not name names here because we're not on social media and I'm a nice person. But there were some crazy conspiracy theorists who were a
few come to mind, but I won't name them either. Just out of the sake of
people
comedy.
You and I are in very different places on this, but I think we would both agree we're putting out reckless, dangerous, crazy stuff about imminent law enforcement action.
And a lot of it was validated by the media.
So in one case that I'm thinking of, the principal case, a certain major media organization published this person on the op-ed page.
Yeah.
And I think there were a lot of people who did not understand the difference between that stuff and real journalism. And so one of the reasons I kept doing Baby Cannon was because as people were...
I keep laughing at the term Baby Cannon. I'm sorry.
That's just my name for her. As people I got concerned that people didn't understand the difference between some of this conspiracy theorizing and properly, heavily reported investigative work.
Right.
And so Baby Cannon, as a weird result, actually mostly of Rachel Maddow, had this kind of weird cult following. And so I thought I could use it as a way of flagging good, well-done reporting journalism. So those were the factors that went into it. Your point that there may have been an effect of ginning up a certain expectation over time that this was all ineluctably leading to a place. All I will say is I never believed that this was all heading in a crescendo to an inevitable place. I never wrote that. I tried to be pretty disciplined about writing, booming stuff that I thought was advanced the story, and also actual court documents that did things. And I would certainly regret if the effect of it were to have done that. I would hope that people would have looked at that stuff in the context of the work that I was writing at the time. But like any reductionist meme that you do repetitively, I mean, I'm sure you're right that there are people for whom it constituted its own body of work that had, that it stood for something that was not necessarily what I intended.
Well, no, I think it's actually commendable if you are acknowledging that even if it wasn't your conscious intention to gin up that kind of frenzied anticipation, if it may have had that effect given the mass audience that came about somewhat quickly during this time period, that merits some self-reflection on your part. I think that's more than most would, concede.
So the answer to your question is I don't know whether it had that effect or not. I think and I do think that the intention of it was to give people a very simple rubric for in this mass of good information, bad information, bullshit.
It's such a huge and sprawling and complicated story that people sort of needed a guide.
So this was one word that told you whether one person who spoke from a point of view of some degree of authority for some group of people thinks, read this one.
Right.
That was really all it was meant to do.
Okay.
Now, I will acknowledge that there is one overt bias in Baby Cannon's oeuvre. And I just want to be candid about it.
Sure.
Baby Cannon did not boom stories that, for example, or court filings that had nothing to do with Trump Russia. So or the obstruction stuff. So for example, I would always joke, Baby Cannon observes strict jurisdictional limits. It's limited to Trump Russia stuff. And that was kind of a legal joke, but there is a latent bias in it, right? So, which one, by the way, I'm not apologizing for. When Devin Nunes would release a supposedly shocking revelation that people that I think were career public servants trying to do their job were actually evil, like Baby Cannon didn't boom that stuff.
Right.
And so is there an asymmetry? Yeah. And that reflects my opinion.
Sure. All right, so let's get to this semantic discrepancy. And the word is collusion, right? So you've spoken about collusion in a colloquial sense, right, which is distinct from any legal, technical legal sense for the mere fact that the word collusion is not found in any federal criminal statutes, correct?
Well, that's not how I would formulate the point.
Well, let me just formulate it, because, which is just to say that you have now raised the possibility, or you've suggested that it's tenable to claim, and others at Lawfare have done the same. For example, Susan Hennessy, on your first podcast after the Mueller report, you asked her, what is your kind of top line takeaway? She said, quote, no conspiracy, lots of collusion. Mm-hmm. Is that, do you agree with that as an apt summarization here?
I certainly don't disagree with it. It's not the particular formulation that I would use.
Okay. Because there's a meme going around on people on the internet in particular with people who are kind of trying to put their own spin on Mueller's report, the findings in Volume 1, where they're insisting that Mueller just didn't technically investigate collusion, right? Even though, at least by my reading, it seems as though he did. So this probably gets to the heart of our semantic difference, because if you look at page 180 of Volume 1, Mueller specifies that the word collude appeared in the scope memo issued by Rod Rosenstein on August 2, 2017.
Correct.
And that memo defined the parameters of Mueller's investigative purview, correct? Meaning Rosenstein identified the word collude as something that Mueller was tasked with investigating, and then Mueller took that directive and applied some legal reasoning to it that you can read in the report on that same page where he says that Mueller understood collusion to be, quote, largely synonymous with conspiracy, and conspiracy would be the relevant federal statutes under which he would investigate this notion of collusion, which I acknowledge, of course, is a more colloquial term than is conspiracy, just by nature of the federal statutes. So, which all leads me to say, it does appear as though Mueller did investigate collusion. Am I wrong?
No, you're not wrong. In exactly the same way that if I said to you, a guy with truly terrible teeth, like really visibly terrible teeth.
Are you making an underhanded comment about my teeth today?
No.
Okay.
I'm just translating this. Your teeth are pristine. Translating this out of the legal arena entirely, out of the collusion arena into some other area. Guy with really bad teeth gets made fun of all his life that he has bad teeth. He goes to the dentist and say, "Do I have bad teeth? What can we do about my bad teeth?" And the dentist, being a dentist, doesn't actually, bad teeth is not a phrase that means very much to him. He's interested in the question of whether there's tooth decay, right? And so he examines the guy for evidence of tooth decay and says, "I don't really know what bad teeth means as a general matter, but I'm interpreting what you're saying as asking whether you have tooth decay. Your teeth, you actually don't have tooth decay." And so the guy then interprets that to mean he does not have bad teeth. That's a close analogy to the way you are, what you've done. And yet, I think we would both agree that that person could have unsightly teeth that a lot of people would look at and say, "Wow, did he grow up in a world without fluoridation?" Or, why are his teeth so, so discolored or whatever.
Maybe we should consult a dentist just to verify that this analogy is apt.
Well, so I just made up everything I needed to know about dentistry in order to have this conversation. But I think you see what my point is, right? Which is so Rod Rosenstein didn't do the best job in the world when he wrote that letter.
The scope memo.
The scope memo.
Yeah.
Because
much of which is still classified.
Right, but I mean, if you look at the way the Justice Department authorized Jim Comey to describe this investigation in his March 20th testimony. Comey said, use the phrase coordination, use the phrase links to, I forget exactly the, he didn't use the word collusion because collusion is actually a term that has no clear meaning.
But whether or not Rosenstein did a, quote, good job, or whether he erred in issuing that memo or the scope memo, nonetheless, he was the one who had jurisdiction over the investigation and therefore had the power to define the parameters.
There is no question that Bob Mueller was assigned the question to investigate, is there any collusion here of a type that would be criminally prosecutable? And there is no question that Bob Mueller concluded, and I want to reserve this issue, that there was insufficient evidence of that to bring any kind of criminal case on that point.
Well, and in some respects, he said there was no evidence, like with regard to the
IRA,
or the Republican platform issue. Or
correct.
Yeah.
But there are some other areas where he said something much more complicated than that. However, in the aggregate, what he said is there is insufficient evidence to bring any criminal case for conspiracy against any U.S. person. And that is the sole aspect of the question of collusion that he was asked to investigate, right? He was asked to investigate whether there was any collusion of a type you could prosecute as a prosecutor.
Well, of course, because he was a special prosecutor. So what else was he going to do with that? I mean, that was his mandate.
Correct.
To find potentially prosecutable crimes.
Correct. And this is where you and I think, have an unbridgeable gap. So let me, can I pose a question to you?
Well, yes, but let's just hone in on this point because, I think you established it, but I just want to kind of distill it into a nutshell version. When people on the internet and Twitter out there tell me Mueller did not investigate collusion, that's just not correct, right?
Correct. That is not correct.
Good. Pose your question.
Mueller investigated collusion to the extent that the collusion could be prosecuted as a crime.
Okay.
Now, here's my question. Was Al Capone a racketeer? Was he a mobster? Was he a murderer?
Al Capone actually makes a cameo appearance in the report. Did you notice that?
I'm not sure I noticed that.
It was in a Trump tweet that was quoted.
Okay, so yeah, right. That Manafort was treated worse than him. So was he a murderer?
I mean, it's been a while since I read up on the full, legal history of Al Capone, but I would say, I think I know where you're going with this, which is that Al Capone was famously, they got him on a technicality.
No, they got him on tax evasion. They charged him with tax evasion. They never charged him with racketeering. They never charged him with murder. They never charged him with running a major criminal investigation. He may have had some prohibition charges, but
Al Capone wasn't subject to a special counsel investigation with the full resources of the U.S. Treasury behind it for 22 plus months.
Actually, we remember the name Elliot Ness today because that is precisely what happened. Now, it wasn't a special counsel investigation. It was a major federal thing. So here's my point. Here's my question.
The special counsel investigation has unique resources and a uniquely broad ambit.
The government threw a lot of resources at getting Al Capone, and they got him on tax evasion. So my question is, number one, do you contend that there is no evidence that Al Capone was a mobster and a murderer and a racketeer? And here's the further thing. Do you contend that those events never happened? Because that seems to me to be what you're arguing about this.
But here's the problem. Collusion is a far more amorphous concept than murder. I mean, if somebody murders somebody...
All right, just take racketeering then. Running a criminal organization. But you're arguing, as I understand your argument, that the absence of sufficient evidence to prosecute should be generally equated with the fact that there is no evidence, and the fact that there is no evidence should be equated with the fact that the thing didn't happen. And I think those are both deep analytic errors.
That's not really my contention. My contention would be that nothing, whether it's evidence furnished by Mueller or even evidence in the, quote, public record that we've known about for years, such as the infamous declaration by Trump in July of 2016, Russia, if you find 30,000 emails, blah, 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 which you actually cited in an April 2017 item on Lawfare.
Yeah, I was outraged by that at the time.
Where the title of which, on April 7th, that you co-wrote was, quote, of course there's evidence Trump colluded with Russian intelligence.
Oh, I wrote about that the day of the thing. There's another piece.
Wait, but you folded into this collusion narrative at least most explicitly on that date.
Correct. Although notice that the explicit. It's been a while since I've looked at that story. The explicit point about that story, is not criminal. Right. The explicit point there is the major scandal here is what he's doing out in the open.
Here's a point I would raise in response to that. Criminal or not criminal, to me, the notion of Trump making that public declaration, constituting in any sense illicit collusion, whether it's prosecutable or not,
it was right out there in the open. It was very public.
Right. So that just doesn't fall under the banner of collusion to me, which kind of, again, everybody has their own private colloquial definition of collusion, apparently, which is kind of one problem we have in discussing this. But I just don't know that I would characterize that as in any sense collusion because there's nothing underhanded or covert about it.
Okay. So first of all, can we agree that nothing turns on the question, given that Trump did what he did out in public on that day, said what he said, nothing turns really on the question of whether I would call it collusion and you wouldn't?
Well, I mean, politically, a lot does turn on it because if you're arguing that the evidence we have available to us now does constitute the conclusion or gives rise to the conclusion that Trump or Trump associates did collude, then that's extremely politically salient.
Okay.
So that's a sense in which something does turn on it.
All right, fair enough. Let's say
there are members of Congress who are saying, like Cedric Richmond, who is actually one of Joe Biden's first endorsers on the day he announced his campaign. Cedric Richmond came out and endorsed him. A moderate Democrat said that Trump, he supports the initiation of impeachment proceedings in part on the ground that Trump, quote, attempted to collude. So it's still a live issue within the political arena.
Okay, fair enough. Let us say one aspect of our disagreement is over whether it is reasonable to use the word collusion to describe the broad pattern of uncontested, pretty open things that the Trump campaign did, including, in my view, the set of things that were not open but are that clearly happened. For example, the meetings, the meeting at Trump Tower, shall we say, negotiations between the Trump organization and the Russian government about building a building. I think one issue is that I take all those things together and I say this pattern of cooperative activity that was pervasively lied about, some of which was in public and some of which was not. I'm pretty comfortable attaching the word collusion to it. You're resistant to that. Not sure how much there is to discuss about that.
Here's why I'm resistant to it, because it almost by necessity conflates the more colloquial, broad, less defined version that you're expounding there with the criminal element, which, as we just established, was investigated by Robert Mueller at the direction of Rod Rosenstein. So people in their minds are kind of confusing the two, which I think has a lot of political ramifications, with one example just being the member of Congress who I cited to you, who now wants to initiate impeachment proceedings. So if you have an objection to Trump getting on national TV in front of the entire assembled press corps in July of 2016 and saying, Russia, if you're out there, find the emails, okay, fine, object to that. I don't find it objectionable in the way that most do, because seemed obvious to me that it was a joke. And I don't know why Trump would reveal anything conspiracy related in front of the entire, on TV. But that aside, if you find that objectionable, okay, but why does that have to be under the rubric of, quote, collusion, which has been this dominant, quote, trope for years and has served to give people the impression that there was something criminally actionable underway, right? Because this is all happening with the specter of the special counsel investigation, looming over everything.
Okay, so I think that's a perfectly fair question, and let me say, I think if Bob Mueller had concluded that the president's explanation of that speech was that it was a joke, and that's
and Trump did say that in his written.
No, I understand. If Bob Mueller had credited that, the way he credited, by the way, the explanation, reasonably seemed to credit the explanation about the campaign Republican Party platform stuff and the meetings with Jeff Sessions, I would say, as I did with that stuff, hey, it seems to be pretty innocent. That's not what Bob Mueller concluded. What Bob Mueller concluded was that the day after Trump, or the same day as Trump made that speech, he privately directed his campaign to recover those emails. And he went to Mike Flynn,
the Hillary private server emails,
correct,
not the hacked DNC or Podesta emails.
Correct. Which
is another thing that gets conflated.
So it doesn't get conflated by me.
Not by you.
If you look at my long tome about this, I specifically say the only reason that there is not a criminal case here is that they were so far off in conspiracy theory land that they were seeking to collude with hackers who didn't exist about emails that didn't exist, rather than the hackers who did exist about the emails that exist.
But you also had journalists at the time who were finding those emails. You had rumors about some nation state possessing them, whether it was Russia or China or whatnot.
Okay, that
was just in the ether at the time.
So I'm just saying, if there is, I'm just spitballing here,
sure.
But if the question is it fair to use the word collusion in a colloquial sense, acknowledging that there is no criminal conspiracy case here, to describe the following fact pattern, and let me get all the way through it.
Sure.
1, the president publicly calls on the Russians to give him or to release a fake set of emails that he seems to believe. He privately directs his campaign to go retrieve that information. The campaign then subcontracts this to a pair of people who in fact try to make contact with Russian hackers, who obtain what they think are emails that turn out not to be authentic. The campaign then...
Which is important.
Oh, yeah, there's no question. They did not succeed in colluding here, but they tried. The campaign then receives intelligence that the...
I just think the verb colluding there is kind of a misnomer. I mean, isn't there another word? I mean, anyway, go on with the fact pattern.
Cooperation with, coordination with. Were they trying to coordinate with Russians about the release of emails? They certainly were. When they were informed then that the Russian Crown prosecutor wanted to give them dirt on the opponent, they responded, "Love it," particularly later in the summer.
There was no such thing as a Russian Crown prosecutor.
I understand that, and you understand that.
It was a music promoter who actually interviewed on my podcast, who is this apolitical guy who was just kind of puffed.
But Natalia Veselnitskaya is not a music promoter and is not an apolitical person, and she is, by the way, under indictment for obstruction of justice.
And Mueller found that she furnished to Trump Jr. and Kushner and Manafort nothing of value, which is why he couldn't charge a conspiracy on the grounds of campaign finance.
Correct. I am not saying that anything serious ended up turning on this as a criminal matter. And on all of this,
one after the other of this fact pattern not amounting to anything of significance, why are we using this kind of dramatic term collusion to encompass it all?
So you're asking me what to make of a member of Congress saying attempted collusion, and I'm saying sounds about accurate to me. And if they didn't,
and by the way, you called Trump the quote colluder in chief in that April 2017.
Yeah, again, all based on public stuff.
Right.
That they were. This was not an allegation of criminality. In fact, it specifically said, "I don't know what illicit secret collusion there may be. I'm talking about what he's done in public." and so I think if your point is that you don't like the use of collusion to describe playing public footsie, I'll say fine. We have a semantic difference there.
Or the widespread use of collusion the word collusion has created a faulty public perception of the issues at hand.
Okay, I think that is a fine debate to have. If your point is you don't think there is evidence of serious attempt at illicit, probably criminal collusion reflected in the document, that I really disagree with.
Probably criminal. I mean, if it was probably criminal, wasn't that Mueller's responsibility to determine?
I fully respect Bob Mueller's.
So you don't think he satisfied his duties?
No, he absolutely satisfied his duties.
Well, just as it was probably criminal.
Just as the prosecutors who do not obtain adequate information to make a case, but can obtain substantial information and don't bring charges, fulfill their duties every day.
I just don't understand how it could be probably criminal, as you just said, and Mueller not have found such. Like
that happens every day.
I know it does, but you're saying so. But if it was so manifestly criminal, or like
no, I didn't. I said an attempt at something that was probably criminal.
Okay.
So
you think another good faith prosecutor in Mueller's position could have concluded that what you say is prominently criminal did rise to the level of bringing charges?
I suspect the evidence isn't there.
Okay.
I suspect Mueller.
Well, that's an important point.
No, and look, you will not see me saying Bob Mueller should have brought X case or the evidence was, But when I look, I'm just saying as a historical matter, when I look at a candidate for president in saying publicly to a foreign intelligence agency, and you can dismiss it as a joke, but the fact that he turns around to his staff and asks them to get the material suggests that it wasn't really a joke. So he says publicly to a foreign intelligence agency, "I want the emails that I think you have, or I want you to get them," and then he instructs his staff, "Please get them," and the staff tries to engage a liaison with hackers to do that. And I think that is an attempt at activity that, if they hadn't been fantasizing, would be very hard to get done without committing a crime.
Okay, let's not litigate that wisecrack from Trump from 2016, which is like seared into everyone's memories for all time now. So let's close with sort of a forward-looking question. You had a piece in the Atlantic this week about your extreme misapprehensions about Bill Barr's conduct, his congressional testimony, and so forth. And one of the things you referenced that you object to in terms of how Bill Barr has handled the Mueller report and the subsequent fallout is that he gave credence wrongly, according to you, to this notion that there was spying on the Trump campaign. And yesterday we saw in the New York Times, which I actually would say is a boom story, although I didn't use that phrase to promulgate it. But, and I'm sure you saw this, right? The FBI, this is according to the New York Times, the FBI sent a spy of some kind, a covert official. We don't know exactly who this individual was. It's this young woman who went by the alias Azra Turk, to London to meet with George Papadopoulos to ostensibly gather information. Papadopoulos claims that she tried to seduce him. So whatever was exactly going on there, assuming the New York Times is correct and that the FBI was responsible for sending that individual, couldn't that reasonably construed as spying, or how would you characterize that if not spying?
So look, there's never been a question that the FBI opened a counterintelligence investigation on George Papadopoulos in the summer of 2016. And so if you want to identify an authorized intelligence gathering technique in the context of an open predicated counterintelligence investigation, if you want to call that spying, again, we're in kind of colloquial territory here. I'm not going to fight with you about that.
Well, Bill Barr says that it's common parlance.
Well, look, I mean, it is common parlance. It's not common parlance by the Justice Department.
It's common parlance by him, and he's the head of the Justice Department. This is what he said in the hearing.
There is no question that Bill Barr said it. I don't call authorized activity in the context of authorized lawful activity in the context of predicated proper counterintelligence investigations. Whether you consider it that is not a word I would use for it. I'm not going to get. And so, to me, the question, and on this I actually agree with Bill Barr, the relevant question is, was it authorized and predicated, and was it appropriate under the circumstances that they found themselves? Now, Barr is darkly suggesting that there was something inappropriate about that. I have seen no evidence of that. And by the way, there is no particular reason to believe, there's nothing on its face about that New York Times story that, sending somebody to meet, to query somebody or reach out to somebody in the context of an authorized investigation is per se improper. I am perfectly content to wait for the Inspector General report.
Because is it potentially improper in your?
Well, hang on just a second.
Sorry.
Yes?
Hey, sorry to interrupt. Cam and Courtney are here for
Okay.
Oh, okay. I've got to wrap up then.
Yeah. 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Is it so? It's potentially improper.
I mean, if it exceeds what was authorized or was not justified by the facts that they had, then it would potentially be improper. I've seen no evidence of that, and I'm more than content to wait for the IG report and see what they have to say.
Would you regard it as improper if the Steele dossier played a more outsized role than we now understand in dictating some of those early investigative steps? I mean, Bob Woodward said that he has heard that John Brennan, the CIA under John Brennan in 2016 was, quote, pushing, that's Woodward's word, the dossier, and actually incorporated it into an intelligence briefing. I mean, is that potentially improper?
So, obviously, look, the FBI takes information from people all the time. And when somebody shows up with potentially,
like David Corn in this instance,
when people show up with information, investigative information in the context of an FBI investigation, you generally don't push them away. You're supposed to vet it. You're supposed to figure out what to make of it. But the FBI takes information from mobsters, terrorists, and
sleazy journalists,
all kinds of nasty people. And so the idea that they shouldn't take information from a British MI6 agent is not intuitive to me. Now, was the information truthful? Different question.
Yeah. And what did they do with it?
What did they do with it? How did they use it? Again, I'm perfectly content to see what the IG has to say on that subject.
Right. And you don't think there's anything inherently authoritarian about Bill Barr or other bodies examining these outstanding issues around the genesis of the investigation.
No, but I do think there is something really inappropriate about him hinting darkly without being willing to put any information on the table in a fashion that smears people in real time right now.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you for doing this. I hope I didn't come
Pleasure.
across as abrasive as I do on Twitter.
No, this was fun, and
Yes.
I'm happy to do it.
You found it fruitful?
Indeed.
All right. Thanks, Ben. Okay, there you have it. Hope you found that edifying. Please remember to subscribe on Patreon. You can also subscribe on iTunes and Stitcher. If you're so inclined, you can provide financial support both through Patreon and PayPal. If you prefer some other method, just contact me through Twitter or email. And also subscribe on YouTube because I've been posting other stuff there. All right, I'll see you next time.